Good evening, this is Thinking Green. Ronna Steller, who is normally hosting the show, is off this week. My name is Tim Hanser and I'll be hosting the show. As anybody who's been watching regularly knows, the last few weeks we've been spending time interviewing different candidates for office. We have elections coming up on November 8th, 3 weeks from today. And despite what you may see in coverage, there is a lot more to talk about than the presidential race, which has been really occupying so much of the media's attention and people's attention. I think it really has put a situation where we may not be getting the information we need from other candidates. In addition to running to the presidential position, we have at least 4 other positions that we'll be voting for in the state of Connecticut. We have a U.S. Senate position, a congressional district. In this district, there are 4 people running for Congress. We also have state Senate and state representative. So with that in mind, this evening we're going to have the Green Party candidate for the 38th district, 38th state rep district this evening, which represents Waterford and a small portion of Montville on this evening, and her name is Lauren Shaw. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
So Lauren, I wanted to start out with just kind of a little bit of background about you. Why is it that you're running? Why are you running as a Green? And kind of give people a flavor for where you're coming from.
Sure. So I'm really running this time around because I feel like there is more to be said on a lot of the issues than a Republican or a Democratic candidate can provide or has traditionally provided. And that's partially why I also ran with the Greens. I feel like they have a much wider range of solutions than the traditional tax and spend type of solutions that we see coming out of the major parties. And specifically why I'm running is I've noticed, as I'm sure many have, that the demographic of those who make up our legislators does not represent what Connecticut needs going forward. So as you might know, the 18 to 35 age group is just leaving Connecticut in droves. And that's really unfortunate because that's the base that we need to fix our economy and move it forward into the future. And one of the tenets of the Green Party is future focus. And so I feel like as a 20-year-old college student here in Connecticut, where I grew up, I understand what we're facing and what we need to do to attract the type of people that, say, GE is looking for, to grow businesses, to put us back on the right track, to find truly innovative solutions to move Connecticut to a better place and keep us growing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The state is losing its young population. It's losing population, just
especially college educated,
kind of at all levels, and
right.
we're seeing this brain drain a little bit. So it'd be very interesting to hear how you think that we can address these issues.
Sure.
Before we talk about some issues, I wanted to talk about some of your endorsements.
Sure.
So can you tell us who you've been endorsed by?
So my first endorsement was from the Connecticut Citizens Defense League. They are they're a pro-Second Amendment lobby here in Connecticut. My next endorsement was from Planned Parenthood, kind of an ideological division there, you'd think, but I guess later I'll talk about how they're actually really similar. And then my final endorsement was from the Association of Retired Teachers.
Okay, so that is a really wide range. So I'd be kind of curious what your thoughts are.
Sure.
And how what's the thread, and how is it that one candidate can get endorsements from really a kind of a broad spectrum
right.
of positions?
It's interesting because if you look at both of them, the CCDL endorsement, they endorse primarily Republicans. They don't endorse based off of party affiliation. That's completely not in the mix, and I believe I'm the first Green to ever be endorsed by them. And then Planned Parenthood traditionally endorses Democrats. And I think they've only endorsed 1 or 2 Republicans this time around and 3 Greens, wow, including myself. So it's interesting how party politics can play into endorsements, as I've seen. But I think it's really interesting that in this case they chose, a Green candidate as opposed to one of the major party candidates.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to how the Green Party and many of its candidates really don't fit into the traditional mold, right, of, are you on the left or are you on the right?
It's a linear spectrum that people espouse, the left and right, but I think it can be seen in many cases that the political spectrum is more of a full circle, and you can start on an issue at one point but eventually come back around and meet where both traditionally left or right stand. Right. And I feel like I'm really at that point.
Okay. So we'll talk about a couple of issues. There's a lot going on with the state. There's a lot of challenges the state faces. This is a particularly challenging fiscal year coming up. The state has had many kind of long-standing legacy issues, and right, I know one of the big areas that the Governor Malloy has really focused on has been transportation. Now
right,
he's got his whole
Let's Go cornerstone.
Right, his Let's Go CT, and
right,
I know you have some opinions about transportation and maybe some issues that aren't really being considered on a larger scale. So I'd like to hear about those.
Oh, sure. So primarily what we've been seeing here in Connecticut when it comes to transportation, and I know you talk about this a lot, is updating highway systems that in ways that aren't actually going to help anything, adding lanes to 95 or expanding highways or putting in bus lines, whatever you want to call it. These are tried and true endeavors that have typically not yielded the results that they seek. And especially what I have studied in my coursework at university, and what I'm really interested in is finding a way to actually take some of the congestion off the roads. There's a system called short haul shipping that I find completely fascinating, and I think Connecticut could really have success if it pursued it. Essentially with short haul shipping, what you do is you take those long haul truckers, those freight trucks, and instead of having a truck drive from Texas to Connecticut to drop off its goods, it will take a boat up the coastline and completely circumvent the highway system and then drop off the goods, in New London or in Bridgeport, and then from there distribute whatever it has on its on the truck. And that, it keeps our highways running longer. It reduces the wear on it by 10 years, reduces congestion, traffic. I think we've seen recently a really horrible accident that has to do with a long haul trucker. And they say that in that industry, it's really hard to find people because it's long hours, people are tired, there's drug issues. It's not the best industry to have clogging all of our roadways, and especially in places like Connecticut where, starting as a colonial state, we don't have necessarily the best transportation system because of the fact that we've just been around for so long, and we don't have roads adept to that sort of movement of large trucks all the time. So this short haul shipping system, we actually have some of the infrastructure in place with our dredged harbors and our ferry system that could be advantageous to help, keep our highways around longer, reduce congestion, reduce air pollution, and actually increase security in case anything happens.
Sure, and it seems like such a solution would really be a boon to kind of the 3 major ports within the state: New London, New
right,
Haven, and Bridgeport. And those of the kind of the urban areas of the state, the 5 urban areas, in addition to those 3 being the other 2 being New Britain and Hartford, which don't really have ports, but these are 3 of the kind of the highest poverty rate areas, highest unemployment rate areas.
And bringing in a new industry to be honest, our marine industry in Connecticut is really waning and is in a really tough spot right now. We don't have enough workers to fill the needs that, the jobs that are here, we don't have enough people. So we're actually bringing in people from Rhode Island and Massachusetts to fill those jobs. And on top of that, there'd be a push, there'd be more jobs, but there'd be also a chance to train people for these skilled positions and provide not just jobs, but good paying, quality jobs.
That sounds great. So what level of kind of startup? What's the infrastructure need at this point? Are we just in a situation where there just needs to be policies in place to really encourage this, or is there real investment that needs to be put in place first?
There would probably be more need for investment to update the harbors and put in the infrastructure to actually have more ships come in and the type of ships needed. Not only that, there'd have to be cooperation between other states to actually send the trucks up our way, and there'd have to be a policy incentive there, be it some sort of tax incentive, some sort of whatever could be used to incentivize companies to use this method as opposed to sending a truck 3,000 miles across the country.
So it sounds like that would be the place where the legislature would really play a key role.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then also, getting those who manage the ports right now on board with the idea.
Okay, great. So I'm going to jump from transportation for the time being. We may come back to it, but want to talk a little bit about energy policy. Now, you're running for a district that represents Waterford and a small part of Montville. And the town of Waterford, as we all know, hosts a nuclear power plant at Millstone. So we already locally are generating a fair amount of energy. There are those who have real concerns about nuclear power. There are those who feel that it's a clean alternative to what the mainstream options are, such as natural gas. So I want to kind of hear what your thoughts are, and what can the state do, and what can you do as a representative to really kind of expand our energy portfolio? Right.
So Connecticut actually has this great asset. It's the Connecticut Green Bank, and what that has been doing is it's a quasi-public bank using private and public money to invest into green solutions. So right now they've been doing a lot of solar, which I believe would be a really great option. I think we should really explore offshore wind. I mean, if you look at all of the states surrounding us, they're all investing and exploring in offshore wind power. And on top of that, I know you asked specifically about nuclear. Millstone is somewhat of an outdated facility. I think this is where I differ with a lot of Greens. I don't think that nuclear is the worst option in the world. I believe that we need to look into modern and updated and safer ways to produce nuclear energy. And I think really as a representative, my focus, not so much on reforming the nuclear energy policy, would be on reforming the fact that I think something between 47 and 48% of our energy supply here in Connecticut is supplied from fracking and is piped in from different areas. And natural gas, while you could say is better than other alternative or other sources of energy, is still not a clean energy. It is, and what fracking does to the environment is horrible, whether or not it's happening in Connecticut. I don't believe we should be supporting that. And I would really, if elected, I would fight against expanding the natural gas here in Connecticut and pushing back and trying to find alternative, greener solutions.
So kind of on that natural gas topic, I know the governor has really pushed very hard for an expansion of the natural gas infrastructure within the state. And while, as you pointed out, there is no fracking site, there's no frackable sites within the state, a lot of that gas being brought in is derived through fracking, through the fracking process. So explain a little bit what the consequences of fracking are, and why is fracking, as opposed to kind of the more traditional approach to getting natural gas, why is this such a concern, and why should we be leery of this approach?
So fracking and the process of fracking, what it does is it dredges up all of these contaminants that get into the air and the soil and water of the sites around it, and really create a toxic, harmful place for those who live in that area. And I believe what we've seen with a lot of those areas is that they're from more disadvantaged populations, which is completely unfair. And the fact that Connecticut supports this industry to that extent, that nearly half of our energy is coming from that sort of source, I find very concerning. It'd be nice to be able just to think about ourselves and what's best for us and how we can get a lower energy bill, but really, especially with the climate crisis just on the horizon, we need to start thinking ahead and how we can move away from processes like fracking, which do pollute our environment extensively. And you can see what's happening out in North Dakota right now. The Dakota Access Pipeline is threatening to contaminate an entire water source for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And just the fact that Connecticut might have or could be potentially seen as linked to that is really concerning for myself.
So what, I mean, besides just not advocating for an increase in that infrastructure, one of the other things that's talked about is the fracking waste.
Right.
So there has been some effort by small groups to have towns pass resolutions
Right.
not allowing the fracking
Right.
waste. So what could the legislature do on that end?
So I believe you're speaking about Wyndham, which tonight is having its town hall meeting about an ordinance to not allow any fracking waste to move through city limits. I believe that the legislators should completely make that a statewide ban, no fracking waste coming through Connecticut, because it's pretty much, it'd have the effect that an oil spill would have on land. It'd contaminate the air, the water, habitats for animals. It would be really detrimental to our environment.
So it'd be a way to not
Right.
only kind of protect the people here in Connecticut, but it would also be a way, by not advocating for this approach to extracting the gas, it'd be
Right.
a way to protect those who are directly impacted by the wells.
Exactly. It's kind of like, you vote with your dollars. It's cutting away from that sort of, what's the word, investment into that industry.
Okay. So we may come back to energy policy,
Sure.
but I want to talk a little bit about the state's finances.
Sure.
As most of us probably know who've been paying attention, this last budget cycle in the state caused a huge number of layoffs at the state level, major cuts impacts to services, and while that was extremely painful, it was a very difficult process. The bad news is it's not over. That the state is projecting in excess of billion-dollar deficit holes that they need to fill for each of the next 2 fiscal years. So we're talking a couple $1 billion, maybe as much as $3 billion over the next two years. So how is it that we can address these issues? Maybe before we talk about how we can address them, what are some of the reasons why we're here in the first place? What bad policies or what short-sightedness has really led us to these types of challenges?
I think a lot of it has to do with, first of all, we have several different money management policies in place, spending caps, bonding caps, ways that we're supposed to be doing our budget, but we're not. And these things have been voted on and approved in the legislature, but never implemented. So I'd say first start with that. We put limits on ourselves, follow the limits. Every household in Connecticut, has a certain amount of budget, and they have to budget within their means. They're not allowed to just, run out and throw everything on a credit card or bond everything. I saw recently that we bonded for a $100,000 mural in one town, and I mean that's, if you look at it comparatively, it's not a necessity. It's not something we should be putting on the credit card. Murals, I think, are great to help the community, but that's something that the state shouldn't be paying for. That's and I guess the short way to say what I'm saying, instead of just rambling on and on about it, is we need to stop allowing pork barreling to happen. We have to stop allowing people to bring home little small projects to give themselves a pat on the back. I would rather see nothing new come into my community, but no debt happen. And I know that's just pie in the sky, non-reality. So I think the real issue here is not the fact that we don't have enough money coming in. I think it's that we're spending our money completely wrong. And I think that on top of that, there is too many layers of bureaucracy, which prevents any sort of informative measures to happen. We have all of these councils and bureaus on different issues, energy or economic development, and we have 15 of them, but do we really need 15? There really needs to be a consolidation in the bureaucracy so that we can stop paying out of our nose for services that we don't actually need, while at the same time fully funding services that we do need, such as DDS, MHAS, education, and the municipal aid packages.
Okay, so that's actually exactly where I was going to go. So this idea, so you had suggested that the real issue is that we aren't prioritizing how we're spending. It's not so much that we're spending too much, it's that we're just not prioritizing it right. So you've kind of started describing some of the areas where you think the funding should be prioritized, but could you kind of expound upon, if there's any other areas you think are of real significance to discuss, or why it is those areas, you said DDS, MHS, and education and municipal aid.
Yes.
So kind of maybe go in a little deeper on those and what you're talking about.
So where to begin? So what did I say? DDS. So DDS, Department of Developmental Services, they serve those with intellectual disabilities and disorders. They serve the elderly, the handicapped, that sort of block, the people who, rely on the state. And some of the solutions that have come out of this have been to privatize DDS and to privatize the group homes. And as a person who has spent her life working with the special needs community, whose family, I have special needs family, I have family who work in the special needs sector. This is an issue that touches me very deeply because while privatization might work in other areas, I don't believe it's the solution here. And when Connecticut comes around for tax cuts, instead of looking at what works and what doesn't, they just say 5% across the board, just cut it across the board. And that's really disenfranchising those who don't traditionally have a voice in this. And it's very cynical to look at it this way, but it's almost as if Connecticut won't finance anything that doesn't make them any money. And that's really what it comes down to, is these people feeling like they've been forgotten by the state and have nowhere else to go because, well, they don't. So prioritize, when you talk about spending, you want to prioritize, DDS, veteran services, and then mental health and addiction services. So mental health and addiction services in New London, which is right next door to Connecticut, where I've been touched personally. I've lost classmates due to the opioid crisis. When they were doing their budget hearings, I don't know if you caught this, but in the same breath as we need to cut MHAS, they said, well, we need to increase the coroner's budget because of all of the opioid deaths that are coming through. And that sort of cognitive dissonance, why aren't we making it so that people stop dying from opioid addiction, right, as opposed to just making sure they get a good, thorough look over once they've already passed? I think that's not only callous, but completely ridiculous and backwards, and I think just goes to show how deeply wrong Connecticut's spending habits are.
So let's stop there for a second. So it seems to me that the cuts to MHS really, when they're dealing with the addiction services,
right,
and really in a situation where we're in the state and really across the country where the opioid crisis is really having substantial impacts on communities, it seems to me that really what the state is saying is not only that this doesn't matter to us, right, but it also is saying this isn't our problem, which
yes,
really just sends that problem down the road to the towns, right, in the state.
And we got a federal grant from the federal government to sort of deal with some of this, and I believe the majority of that money went to funding Narcan and naloxone for first responders and school systems. And I think while that's part of the solution, that's kind of putting a Band-Aid on the issue. That's not going to help the person in the back of the ambulance at the end of the day if they still can't get into a rehabilitation service. Right. So just little stuff like that. I feel like, and talking to voters, knocking doors, they really feel that the consensus is that Connecticut is just the people elected to office are really doing things to get themselves a pat on the back. They're not actually looking at the issues. They're not ready to face a little bit of hard times, a little bit of scrutiny in order to, in the long run, put us in a better position so that future generations can sustain and grow Connecticut.
Okay. So yeah, just sticking on this issue just for a little bit longer, the other thing that's just kind of occurring to me about this particular case is that when you're cutting addiction services and when you're saying we as a state don't care, or we should say this isn't our priority, right, and the towns need to figure this out, what you're also doing is not simply kind of passing the buck, but you're passing it to organizations that are neither have the funding capacity to take it on themselves, or the expertise to do that.
Exactly. And
it seems to me that one of the places where this really fails is that we've allowed a system where those who were doing the work were trained in the field, and were really, that was their focus, right, and now we're handing it off to public safety personnel who right, are not trained in how to address these issues.
Which will only exacerbate the issue further. And
right,
at the end of the day, we're going to have to look and see really. It'd be nice if we could stop here and go, no, we're going the wrong direction, and fix it. But as the trend has been seeming to go, I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, which is unfortunate to say, but that's why we need to have, more voices in these elections, and that's why I'm proud to be running to say, stand up and say, no, this isn't what we need to be doing. We need to be funding education, prevention, rehabilitation, as opposed to these little Band-Aids that are Narcan.
Okay, so let's. I mean, the two other ones you talked about were education and municipal aid. So let's talk a little bit about why you think those need to be prioritized, and maybe a little bit about where that funding should be going within those categories.
So to clarify, do you mean? Let's talk about education for
instance. Let's talk about education.
So Waterford did end up getting $1 million of its education funding cut. I don't believe that was because of the CJEF case. I believe that happened prior to it, which hurts. Any sort of funding cut would hurt any municipality, and I don't. I'm not too intricately versed in this issue, but I can understand that it probably came from a matter of partisan politics up in Hartford, where we have currently sitting a Republican and it's a Democrat-held House, but also in part because for whatever reason, we just weren't deemed worthy enough to have that $1 million, and it was sent either to a different school system or used to pay for something that it wasn't slated to pay for.
Right. So you referenced CJEF. So CJEF is the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding. They had filed a lawsuit against the state of Connecticut. It was officially called CJEF versus Rell, because Governor Rell, Jody Rell was the governor at the time. And one of the things that was pointed out in the ruling was that there are 14 of the 16 poorest towns in the state. The only two accepted were Stamford and Danbury. All lost money last year, collectively lost, I believe it was a little over $5 million. And then there were these 20 other towns. And they weren't Greenwich, New Canaan, and Darien, but they were Farmington, West Hartford, Simsbury. They were kind of the next category. And they gained $5 million. So what you're talking about, and I kind of want to tie this to something else you'd said, what you're talking about is really partisan politics and this idea that elected officials are not making decisions based on good policy. They're making decisions based on re-elections.
Exactly, and even my Democratic opponent spoke to this when they asked her why she ran, and the summation of what she said was, I'm a Democrat and Democrats are ruling the House and the Senate, so if you want anything done here in Connecticut, you better vote for me, because that's the only way you're going to have anything done is if you have a Democrat in your seat. And that's just completely abysmal to me. I cannot believe, first of all, that she said it, but the fact that she's partly right.
Well, and that seems to be something that somebody can say that, and really everybody just kind of nods their head and says, as much as they may dislike it, they say, well, that really is how politics works in Connecticut. And I think that really kind of gets to the foundation of some of our challenges.
Yes. That
we are making decisions based on who has power as opposed to what's good policy.
Exactly.
I think about education funding as one of those places where it's a real problem.
It was commented to me by a reporter earlier this week that people in Connecticut, they know they're a Republican or they know that they're a Democrat, but they can't tell you why. And I think it really comes down to who has the power at the time. And you see candidates all over the state switching parties last minute because their party wouldn't let them run and they just really wanted to run. Or you have really strong candidates told that it's not their turn and that they just need to wait 2 years or 4 years or whenever it is until it's their turn, like it's a game, like it's a high school club. And that's really what it feels like. It's very petty and it's just high school all over again.
So what can we do about that? How do we change this discourse? How do we change this approach to this high school approach to setting budgets and priorities? I mean, what are some steps? Obviously, you can't solve all the problems yourself.
Of course not.
But what can you do to really change that?
We could begin by reducing finance barriers to third parties. In my debate this week, my Republican opponent, who sits on the Public Campaign Finance Board, said yes, there are barriers that third parties have to face that the other parties don't, which I really respected her for saying and acknowledging. So we can tear that down, make it more of a level playing ground. We can do various things. We can implement ranked choice voting, which if you look at the polls now in the presidential election, you have numbers like Hillary Clinton polling at 42% and Donald at 41%, and that's 83%. So 17% of the electorate isn't going to be represented, or I know earlier the numbers were even lower. They were down to like 38, 37, and you're getting close to 40% of the electorate that's not being represented, and that's because of different barriers put on third parties, but also because there isn't what seems to be a viable option for many in the third party realm.
So kind of on that, so from electoral...
There's one more point. Can I make one more point?
Was it regarding elections, or was it kind of just how you change things?
Both.
Okay, well, let's hear it out.
Final point, randomized ballots, because the way it is in Connecticut, you can vote all the way down the line. You don't have to know anyone's name. You don't have to know what they stand for. You just have to know what party they represent. And I believe that if we had randomized the ballot, that would really change up some of that and really force voters to look at who's running, what they stand for, and whether or not they should be supported.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in New London there is one of the parties in town who has a slogan based on the line there. It rhymes very nicely.
Yes.
I won't repeat it now, but it's something that during the last election cycle at the local level, I ran for office, and I was one who really kind of took offense to that idea, and others did as well. And this idea that you don't need to look at the people. You can just blindly vote for a party, when we all really know that we don't have a parliamentary system. It's the person that matters.
Exactly.
So kind of on this idea of how we change the electoral process, one of the things you talked about was how there are barriers for third parties. So I guess one of the things, talking to friends of mine and talking to family members who are not really big advocates for third parties, there's always the question, so what? Who cares? Why is it that third parties matter? What is it that they can bring to an election that cannot be brought to an election by the system we have currently?
So currently, in response to many people who tell me that, so what? I say, well, are you satisfied? And they go, no. Well, are you voting for someone who represents your values, or are you voting against someone who doesn't? And they go, well, I'm voting against so-and-so. I never vote for anyone, I vote against. And when you look at how our election system was set up, we're supposed to be supporting people who represent us, not voting against people who don't. And while those two may seem like the same side of the coin, they're really not. And what third parties bring into the to an election is a different line of discussion. So, espousing opinions that might not be popular, but may be very relevant and necessary for the discussion. I know down here in southeastern Connecticut, no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you come out against the defense industry, that's the end of your campaign. And while the defense industry is important, and I believe to an extent we need to support it, we also have to recognize that it's not a long-term solution. We can't rely on it for the next 100, 150 years. And I believe we need to be having discussion now how we're going to transition out of that, so we don't have an economic collapse when we know the world no longer needs submarines.
So what you're saying is that having third-party candidates really be allowed to exist within the system as peers.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they're any more or less likely to win, but they're treated equally. They're treated the same way the Republican Party is treated, and the same way the Democratic Party is treated. What you're saying is that it allows for kind of a broader discussion on topics.
And not only a broader discussion, it's been shown that when you have consistent third-party activity, that more moderate candidates are brought up because they're needed to bridge that gap. And if you look at what's happening, at the national election, which I know personally I've stopped looking at, it's just too much to watch, too much of a circus. You have two people who are really polarizing their bases, pulling away from what actually needs to happen, which is a moderate solution in between both parties, because no one's ever going to get exactly what they want. So being able to bring in moderate candidates who are willing to work with both sides of an issue in order to formulate the best solution, not the Republican solution or the Democrat solution, the best solution is what we need, and that's why third-party candidates or fourth-party candidates are important to elections.
Okay. So yeah, it seems like the what has in my lifetime has really kind of polarized. I think back to 1992 at the presidential level. We won't discuss details of who ran and all that, but there was a third-party candidate, and he actually he got a lot of votes, and he was allowed in the debates. And one of the issues, or two of the issues he brought forward as really key issues and concerns for him were free trade and a balanced budget. And while he didn't win, and while I can't say that he succeeded in getting things the way he wanted to in both of those cases,
Right.
it did force those other candidates to take positions, to clarify their positions.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, the balanced budget did, for a very brief period of time, actually take place. And it's hard to believe that such a thing would have happened if it weren't for that conversation and his
Right.
opportunity to be involved. So I think, that's a presidential, national level issue,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there's a lot of opportunity. What you're saying is there's a lot of opportunity at the local level to
Absolutely.
create that same type of dialogue.
Exactly. I would completely agree with everything you say. I don't think I have any more to expound
Okay,
upon.
so let's see. One of the other things, I think we kind of went on a tangent before
Right.
we started talking about education funding, or we talked about education funding.
Sure.
But one of the other things you talked about was municipal aid. So can you kind of expound on why you think that's an important piece of,
Right.
of state funding and state budgets, but also what is it that type of aid provides?
So that type of aid, when sent to municipalities, it helps with not essentially running their town, but with infrastructure, might supplement their education budgets, and libraries, that sort of stuff. So municipalities, rely on this sort of aid, and they factor it into their budgets. And when it's cut, it could lead to services on the local level being cut as well, which has ripple effects into the community, and it's really detrimental, especially to the more impoverished or lower economic areas where a large segment of the population does rely on public services. So I believe in this case it was pretty obvious why it was cut, and I think it just goes on to what we were saying before. It was cut because the Democratic governor did not get something that he wanted passed in the legislature, and he kind of flexed his muscles on that and cut aid to municipalities that just in a way, very petty. Back to our earlier discussion, it's very petty.
And it seems like not only that, but what's being done is kind of the same thing we were talking about with
Mm-hmm.
Department of Mental Health Services, which was that the cuts being made are really just kind of passing the buck. This idea
Yes.
that, okay, so we're just going to pass it down the road. And
Right.
like you pointed out, so in a community like, kind of to go to one extreme, in
Sure.
a community like Greenwich, if Greenwich were to lose some state aid, they have the ability to raise that revenue
Right.
themselves without really having it be a major impact on their town.
Exactly.
Whereas kind of on the other extreme
Mm-hmm.
Would be places like New London, or even kind of the smallest municipality in the state,
Mm-hmm.
Derby, just doesn't have the land mass, much less the wealth
raise that revenue.
to raise that revenue without having a huge
Yeah.
impact on the community.
And even if you look at Waterford, which is considered to be one of the more well-off towns, here in Waterford, the state of Connecticut just put out a report so there's this concept called ALICE. It's, I'm trying to remember that.
It's
It's
asset
asset limited,
limited,
income constrained,
employed.
and employed. So 25 to 33% of families in Waterford are considered ALICE families, where if there was, I think it's a $5,000 emergency, they wouldn't be able to make that, and it cause them to default on loans, payments, et cetera, and have just $5,000, which doesn't seem like a lot of money, really kind of wreak havoc in their lives. So when you cut municipal aid, municipalities are forced to raise property taxes, cut services, all these sort of things. And I mean, in Waterford, again, we had the Friendship School, and some of these families relied on the Friendship School as a source of affordable pre-K to K education. And should that school close down, that'll really put out a lot of families, because childcare is, in my opinion, just extraordinarily too expensive. But that's just another example of how that impacts us here in Waterford.
Yeah, the Alice work that's been done by the United Way is really very
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Actually, of all the towns within New London County, only one of them doesn't have an Alice percentage over 25%. And
Really?
it's interesting. It's ledgered.
How is it?
It's at 21%, so it's not like it's
Very
really that
close,
far. We talk a lot about poverty. We talk about
Mm-hmm.
poverty rates and whether you're below the federal poverty line. In New London, we're almost 20%. In other communities, it's lower.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, those below the poverty line have services available to them.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be sufficient, but they do have services. Whereas this Alice group,
Right.
which is the whole point of this study, is these are families and individuals who really don't have opportunities to take advantage of different programs.
Right. Because they're at the threshold or slightly above it.
Right. And anything that happens really can be devastating.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's funny because I know it wasn't necessarily something we were going to spend too much time on, but I think it speaks a lot to the region's economy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time where this region was never a wealthy region, but it had very low unemployment rates.
Mm-hmm.
People had solid jobs. This was not an area that was precarious in its living. And I'd be kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on what the state has done over the years regarding the local economy, and what can we do differently to maybe make the region and the people who live here a little more self-sufficient.
Right. I find southeastern Connecticut to be especially fascinating because within a single municipality, you can have students who are on reduced lunch while the person next to them is driving a Ferrari to school. It's really, you have these two very extremes where you have extremely rich areas. Specifically, I'm thinking about over in Groton, with the Groton Long Point area, and even here over in Niantic and the Waterford Village area, very prosperous regions, and then you have very impoverished regions right next to it. And it's strange to look at that, because if you look at the other side of the state, we have this little corner up there in the northwest that's very prosperous all across the board, essentially. So when you look at the local economy here, it's really driven by the defense industry. Mm-hmm. We had Pfizer for a while. We still have Pfizer, but as far as big money coming in, there's not so much, and I think we really rely on more of the local businesses to fuel our economy and to provide jobs. And what Connecticut has done is actually made it more difficult to run a small business between taxes, increases in taxes, retroactive taxes, and I know it's not Connecticut's fault, but mandates on health care, all of these little things that have added up to make it more and more difficult not only to run and maintain a small business, but even to get your foot in the door. I am a 20-something-year-old. I've looked at starting my own business. As soon as you register, your business, you're smacked with a $250 fee. Just to exist here in Connecticut, you have to pay $250. And on top of that, the way, independent contractors are taxed. You get taxed as an employee and as an employer. So you're paying double the taxes as if you worked for some, other business. And streamlining and kind of reducing barriers for employment, I think, is really what Connecticut needs to do to move into a way. If you look at it, we're at the very bottom of every list as far as business friendliness or business attractiveness goes. And while we've been more looking at the larger corporations like GE, like Sikorsky, that doesn't help mom and pop shops. It doesn't help small businesses, which actually are the ones that are fueling our economy. I think isn't the number, I don't know if you would know, but something like every dollar you invest into a small business returns 7 back into your community.
Yeah, it's in that scale.
It's in that scale, absolutely. Right? So I find it strange that we're paying $200 million plus to a hedge fund, and what do hedge funds contribute to their community?
Right.
The answer is they don't. They move around other people's money and take a small percentage of it. So why are we spending money on that instead of funding education, municipal aid, DDS, MHAS, making it easy, giving investments and loans to small businesses so they can grow and stay here in Connecticut instead of leave?
Yeah, it seems that the approach the state's taken has been this kind of swing for the fences approach.
Right.
This is a term I've used when I've run for office on
Sure.
on development in New London. This idea that everybody's trying to hit a home run,
Right.
and we're only sticking to the big guys. Sikorsky just got a big amount of a grant from the state.
It's another $200+ million thing.
$million. And when you look at how much it was costing per job, it wasn't outrageous. But
no, it was actually a decent deal.
But when you consider this is a company that has billions of dollars
right.
in revenue
and it's a
every
manufacturing.
Year.
What they do is manufacturing. It's not like GE. GE is for lack of a better, I'm going to be very callous here. It's a bunch of cubicles, is what GE was. And when they moved to Boston, despite all of the incentives they got out of Boston, it's actually more expensive to operate there. And going back to what I said earlier, part of the reason they left was because of the human capital,
Right.
attracting the people who want to work and live there. And Sikorsky, I know part of the reason they gave them that deal was not only for them to stay in headquarters here, but also because if we lose those jobs, we lose a whole skill set that we are severely lacking here in Connecticut.
And it seems like we're not planning ahead.
We're not planning ahead at all.
We're not thinking about those types of things.
What is it? You're putting the finger in the dike instead of building up the dam sort of deal. And it's really unfortunate because, I plan to stay in Connecticut. I was recently married. This is where I want to start my family. And you have the questions, well, am I going to be able to support a family? Am I going to have to wait until I'm much older in order to have the capital to support a family? And all these life decisions that recent college graduates are looking at, it's also, well, where is my room to grow? Where is my room to really innovate? And unfortunately, it's not in Connecticut because we don't have those big industries that millennials are looking for. But we could definitely have. I could realistically see New Haven becoming the next Boston if we properly invested and supported specific policies to create that sort of atmosphere to attract the 18 to 35-year-old college-educated group to. I'm rambling, but
I think you're absolutely right. And I've lived in Connecticut for 15 years, and actually my first stop as I was moving here in my car was to Pepe's. That's where I had lunch on my drive in. So New Haven is kind of like one of the first things I've ever experienced about Connecticut, and to see how much it's changed, and its population has grown. It's in spite of loss throughout the state, it's really stabilized itself, and it's taken an approach of we're going to make it a nice place for people to live. We're going to make these small investments. These have been done mostly by the city itself, and they have those resources. Whereas New London or Waterford or Montville don't have those types of resources. Now, I kind of want to just spend a little more time on this topic. So in 2005, there was a round of BRAC. There's a BRAC commission, base realignment and closure. And initially, the subbase in Groton was slated for closure.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, it was not closed. In reaction to that, Governor Rell commissioned a blue ribbon panel to evaluate the economy of southeastern Connecticut, because what she recognized was that we rely very much so on the subbase and the defense industry for jobs and for our local economy. And one of the things that came out of that commission, the recommendations, were to diversify investments. And really what the state has actually done is the exact opposite.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting that this is another example of how the state is making decisions counter to its own policy recommendations.
Exactly. So I've done some research on it, and I believe General Dynamics out of that and decided to invest in a telecommunications company, but that's about it. As far as General Dynamics and EB, fortunately for this area, right now they are receiving heavy grants and subsidies from the federal government, so that we don't have to worry about that right now. And Two-Sub Joe is coming in, and I think, and for a lot of people, that's the only reason to vote for him, is simply because he is able to bring in those submarine contracts. But like I pointed out before, how many submarines does the world need?
Right.
How long can we've really gotten to the point where our economy is reliant on war, whether it be for defense industry, manufacturing, airplanes, submarines, aircraft carriers, a lot of those which don't actually work. There's serious issues with those construction projects, or be it for natural resources, oil, or et cetera. The oil wars is what they're being called now. We cannot live in a perpetual state of war.
Right.
It can't happen. And I think it's the responsibility of a corporation like General Dynamics, and not only that, the communities which rely on it, Groton, New London, even as far as Westerly, Rhode Island, huge numbers of people being employed there, to look at it and say, what are we going to do when the day comes that we cannot build a submarine? And what I've looked into extensively is manufacturing offshore wind turbines. And since that is such a emerging and fast developing market, Connecticut needs to get in there, get in the door, so that it can be that center and really ride the wave of success before other states can jump in. And I think that's the case for Connecticut and a lot of industries. You can look across the board, whether it be manufacturing or healthcare reform or recreational marijuana. All of these things would bring in new economic resources to Connecticut if it were the first, but unfortunately we are very, very much lagging behind other areas in the region.
Yeah, and so it sounds like really what you're advocating for is being proactive and really
yes.
thinking forward.
Very novel concept here in Connecticut.
It seems to be something we've struggled with. So we've only got 2 minutes left, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time making sure that people knew where you'd be next or where they can listen in. So this Friday you have an event at Connecticut College.
I do. There is going to be a youth in politics seminar and kind of just about the importance of having younger voices and ideas and getting involved as soon as you can in politics. And it won't just be myself. It'll be Andre Baumgardner, who's running in the 41st, and Chris Soto, who is running in the 39th. So those two will both be there, and I think a few other speakers, but that'll be a really great event. It's in the lobby there at Conn College. It starts at 11:50 and goes until 1, and you'll get a chance to hear from the candidates, to get some information and kind of connect with others of like-minded
So
ideas.
the lobby of Crozier Williams? Or
I believe it's Baumstein. I'm totally
Okay.
botching that.
So
It'll be on my Facebook page and my website.
And your Facebook page is Lauren Shaw for District 38,
Yes,
and your website is laurenshawfor38.com.
that is correct. Yep,
Okay.
and we're still accepting donations and all of that as well. There's
So-
my little plug.
And you'll also be having a debate that will be broadcast live on 94.9 next on the 23rd, which
Yes,
is Sunday.
Sunday
at 1
the
o'clock.
23rd at 1 o'clock. It'll be on the radio, 94.9, or you can join us at Langley's in Waterford to watch the debate live. It'll be not only myself and the candidates I'm running against, but also the East Lyme candidates.
Great. So, like I said, we're just about out of time. I just want to give a couple more plugs on some events that are coming up. So this Thursday is the 2nd Congressional District debate at Eastern Connecticut State University up in Willimantic. It is at 7 p.m. at the concert hall in the new Fine Arts Instructional Center. I'm sure if you look on the Norwich Bulletin's website, who is the host for the event, you'll get more information on that. And here in New London on Friday the 21st, we will have Halloween Town from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. That's down on Waterfront Park. Thank you all for joining us, and good night.
Thanks. That wasn't as painful as I thought it'd be.
Africa, we know Africa. we made